James Hartford was a man who had it all: power, wealth, a sprawling estate in the hills of Vermont, and a legacy that spanned multiple industries. But in his heart, James often felt poorer than the average man. Not because he lacked anything material, but because he feared he had failed at something far more important: raising children who knew how to love, not just inherit. At 73, James could feel time pressing on his back. He sat more often than he stood, and the sparkle in his blue eyes had dimmed. But one fear kept him from peace: his children. There were three of them. Alexander, the oldest at 38, was a sharp-tongued businessman who lived and breathed Wall Street. His mind was a ledger, and he calculated people the way he calculated profit margins. Isabella, 34, was a globetrotter, influencer, and fashion consultant who barely had time for phone call unless it involved red carpets or high society parties. Michael, the youngest at 29, was the artist of the family. He lived in a modest apartment, taught music at a public school, and often refused his father's money, preferring to earn his own path, as he put it. James often wondered if the luxury he provided for his children had robbed them of compassion. Had he given them so much that they no longer knew how to give? One evening, as the leaves fell red and gold outside their grand estate, James turned to his wife. "Julie, I need to know," he said. "Before I leave this world, I need to know if they love me, or just my money." Julie looked at him with furrowed brows. "James, they're your children."
He sighed.
"That doesn't guarantee anything. Not anymore." And so they devised a plan. James faked a stroke. It was convincing. With help from a trusted doctor and nurse, both sworn to secrecy, James was confined to a wheelchair. He slurred his words, dropped food from his trembling hands. He stopped attending board meetings and pretended to hand everything over to his lawyers. Rumors spread that the billionaire patriarch was no longer of sound mind. And then they made the final move. James changed his will. Julie let it slip that James had written Michael, the youngest and poorest, as his sole heir. No one knew why, and Julie refused to explain. And now, the stage was set. The first visit, Alexander. Alexander arrived at the estate with the same energy he brought into boardrooms. He wore an expensive navy suit and never took off his Rolex. He greeted his mother with a tight hug, then walked into the room where James sat slumped in a wheelchair, drool at the edge of his lip, eyes dull. "Dad," Alexander said stiffly, standing over him. "Tough seeing you like this." James said nothing, just gave a low grunt and reached a trembling hand toward his son. Alexander took a step back. "Look, I've got meetings in Manhattan, so I can't stay long.
Just wanted to check in."
"Oh, and Mom mentioned something about a change in the will. You should know I've always been loyal. Loyal to the family business. I hope that counts." He patted James awkwardly on the shoulder and left 5 minutes later, leaving the scent of cologne and indifference in the room. The second visit, Isabella. Isabella showed up 2 days later, wearing Gucci heels and a designer bag the size of a carry-on. "Oh my God, Dad," she gasped when she saw him. "You look worse than I imagined." She stayed standing, too afraid to sit too close. She kept checking her phone, sighing dramatically whenever James made a sound. Julie offered her tea. "Do you want to feed him some soup?" "He hasn't eaten in hours," Julie said gently. Isabella's nose wrinkled.
"Me? Ugh."
"Mom, I love Dad, but I'm not trained for that. Also, do we really need to keep him at home? Why not a private care home with, professionals? We can afford it." Julie said nothing, just watched. Isabella left in under 20 minutes, muttering something about a shoot in Paris and not enough hand sanitizer in the house. The final visit, Michael. Michael arrived quietly. He didn't call ahead.
Didn't text.
He just appeared at the doorstep with a worn-out backpack and tired eyes. When he saw his father in the wheelchair, tears filled his eyes instantly. "Dad," he said softly. James gave the same low, garbled grunt he had given the others. Michael dropped to his knees beside him. "Hey," he whispered, taking his father's trembling hand into his own. "It's okay. I'm here now." He stayed the night. Michael fed James, changed his clothes, cleaned up after him without hesitation. He sat beside him, telling stories from their fishing trips, even when James gave no indication he could hear. He stayed for 2 weeks. During that time, Michael cooked for Julie, did laundry, and even fixed a broken gate outside. Every night, he slept on the couch beside James' bed, just in case he needed anything. Finally, James decided it was time. It was a Sunday morning. Soft sunlight filtered through the curtains, and the scent of pancakes filled the house. James slowly wheeled into the kitchen by himself. Michael nearly dropped his plate. "Dad." Julie smiled tearfully from the stove. James stood up, stretched, and walked over to his son. Michael's mouth opened, but no words came. James put a hand on his shoulder. "You passed," he said, his voice steady and strong. Michael blinked. "Passed what?" "The test," Julie said gently. "He wasn't sick, sweetheart. He was pretending to see who really loved him, without money in the picture." Michael stood in stunned silence. Then he shook his head slowly, tears forming again. "I didn't do it for money, Dad. I did it because you're my father." James nodded. "And that's why you're the only one who deserves it." The reading of the will. A week later, all 3 children were summoned to the family lawyer's office. Alexander and Isabella were still in shock. Their father looked perfectly healthy, sitting at the head of the table like he used to. "I wanted to see who you all were," James said, his voice calm. "Not as heirs. Not as shareholders. Just as people." He looked from one child to the next. "Alexander, you love power more than people. Isabella, you love your image more than your family. And Michael," his eyes softened, "you have a heart that's richer than my bank account ever was." The lawyer opened the will and read. "To my son Michael, I leave the Hartford estate, my shares in all businesses, and the trust fund worth $500 million. To Alexander and Isabella, I leave the life you chose. You already have more than enough." The room was silent. You could hear a breath drop. A few months later, the Hartford businesses thrived under Michael's leadership. But he didn't change. He donated millions to charities, set up free music programs across the country, and every Friday, he wheeled his now genuinely ailing father to the lake for a quiet afternoon of fishing. As for Alexander and Isabella, money came, money went. But the weight of that day in the lawyer's office followed them for the rest of their lives. Moral of the story: love is not proven in words or inheritance. It's shown in quiet rooms, through soup bowls and clean sheets, through nights spent beside a bed, not for fortune, but for love. James learned something, too. It's not about how much you give your children, it's what you teach them to value. And if they learn to value love over money, then they are richer than any billionaire ever could be.